Polaris was a very interesting product from AMD, initially comprising of the Radeon 400 series. On the face of it, it should have been dull, a new lineup without high-end parts that offered performance and power consumption similar to products we had already seen. But AMD did everything right with it, turning it into a surprisingly interesting product. But for reasons beyond AMD's control, it failed to achieve the mainstream success it perhaps should have obtained. I will talk about it in this video with the power of hindsight. But first, we need to go back a decade. Back. To AMD's 4000 series, which isn't Polaris, but its name is similar. In 2008, Nvidia launched the Geforce 280, the fastest single graphics card in the world. It would have cost you $650. AMD didn't have a graphics card that was as powerful, but they didn't have to. Instead, they launched their Radeon 4800 series. For $300, you could get the 4870, a card that was 94% the speed of the 280, but more importantly, cost less than half the price. A single card was already overkill for most games, and if you wanted more, then you could always buy two of them for less than the cost of one Geforce 280. It was kind of a no-brainer. And for $200 was the Radeon 4850. With this card, AMD finally had an answer to the Geforce A800 and 9800, which had gone unchallenged for years. With these cards, AMD were highly competitive, and it resulted in an incredible price war that allowed gamers at the time to get a high-spec PC very cheaply. I got a 4850 3 months after launch for £115. Most of us probably only care about price and performance, and brand name. But the size and efficiency of the graphics cards can tell you a lot about the state of the company. AMD's success with their Radeon 4800 series was because it was only half the size of Nvidia's 200 series, allowing for AMD to sell them cheaper and making them consume a hell of a lot less power. But since then, things haven't been so positive for AMD. Nvidia's 600 series marked the first time their card was smaller than the AMD card it competed against. Oh dear. The Geforce 680 wasn't just more powerful than AMD's 7970, but also smaller and more efficient. After that, AMD resorted to making bigger and bigger chips in order to compete. They released the 290X next, and it was large, hot, and power hungry. Worse than Nvidia's cards at the time. The slightly cut down 290 got an amusing review over on AnandTech. It was almost as fast as the 290X, but cheaper. It was a bargain. And yet, despite being faster and cheaper than anything it competed against, which are the two most important things, it was so loud that they actually recommended against buying it. Hilariously, everybody complained about this, and they had to update the review being all like, "Oh okay, we're sorry, we think it's unacceptable, but it seems you guys don't mind." You don't get that every day. Things only got worse for AMD as Nvidia launched the Geforce 900 series. Not only were these faster, but smaller than AMD's and much more efficient. All AMD could do was to launch the 390X, which was just the 290X again but with a few tweaks. It was beginning to show its age, and Nvidia were undisputedly ahead in every way. For a while, both companies focused on the ultra high end. Nvidia won here as well, and then even began launching their next generation series, starting with their super expensive and super fast Geforce 1070 and 80 cards. What could AMD do? They decided not to compete head on, and instead resorted to the strategy they had done all those years earlier with the Radeon 4800 series. The new cards were codenamed Polaris. They were designed to be small, affordable graphics cards that would be slower than Nvidia's best, but would be the better choice for most people simply by being better value for money. After all, not everybody gets a Geforce 1080. Most people don't have a graphics card at all, in fact. But the sweet spot in the gaming market was in the mid-range, at around $200. Make a good card for that price, and there will be a market for it, especially if it's faster than any $200 card before it. And that's what they hoped to do with Polaris, the fastest of which would be called the Radeon 480. But did it manage it, as the 4800 series had done 8 years earlier? It started well for Polaris. I think it was wonderfully marketed. In a presentation months before its launch, they touted how efficient it would be, which was needed, since this had been AMD's weakest point for quite a while. They also made a big deal about how affordable Polaris would be. They had the confidence to compare two of them to a Geforce 1080, claiming that it would be faster and cheaper. Sounds very much like the Radeon 4800 series all over again, doesn't it? And hey, even if it wasn't the fastest graphics card, it would still be VR ready. That's what people cared about at the time. It was a performance level previously out of reach of many, and if it was fast enough for that, then it would be fast enough for most people. But the name of the card was also important. Ending the name with an 80, which was always AMD's mid-range series, kind of implied that there might be a faster 90 out later. This was never said, but it made the launch acceptable. By leaving space for a 90 series as they had done in the previous 2 generations, it didn't sound as though AMD had given up on the high end. But at the same time, we were excited for this new, cheaper card. It sounded like a product that everybody could find a use for. Imagine how great the 490 would eventually be when that was announced. So, how good was Polaris? On release, it was available for under $200 and performed similarly to the much more expensive high-end cards from previous generations, whilst consuming a lot less power than older AMD cards. It was a great card, at a very cleverly chosen price. But it still wasn't as good as the Radeon 4800 series had been back in 2008. For a start, while the Radeon 4870 was within striking distance of the fastest card available at the time, the Geforce 280, the Radeon 480 was only 60% the speed of the fastest Geforce 1080. That's not close enough to pass as an alternative, or even as a high-end card. Nvidia had moved the goalposts too far for that. And while 60% of the speed for a third of the price is still impressive, the $200 4850 back in 2008 would have gotten you 75% of the speed of the Geforce 280. So while Polaris gives you a lot for $200, it's not the best $200 card ever. But it still had the power to run new games at 1080p with most settings set to maximum. Unfortunately, this was another thing to have changed. 1080p was no longer the golden standard. Nvidia cards were aiming higher. The Geforce 1070 could power 1440p gaming, and the 1080 was flirting with 4K. AMD initially marketed the Radeon 480 as a 1440p capable card. I think that's a bit cheeky, but I see why they did it. It would be over a year before their high-end Vega cards would launch, and they needed something for gamers who wanted to dabble with higher resolutions. And yet, Polaris could do it if you didn't mind dropping graphic settings a bit. It takes years to develop a new card. When AMD started on something like Polaris, they didn't know what the world would be like by the time it was released. Luckily for them, the Radeon 480 proved to be just about powerful enough for everything it needed to do. 1440p, VR, a rival to the Geforce 970. If Polaris had been any slower, then I think it would have been a disappointment. On the other hand, any faster would have been a welcome bonus, and would have aided it in the many battles that lay ahead. While it wasn't a competitor for Nvidia's 1000 series, which cost a lot more anyway, it did a lot better against the older Geforce 900 series, which was still being sold as mid-range cards. I would say that Polaris' speed was somewhere between the Geforce 970 and 980, and consumed roughly the same amount of power as well. I think people were hoping that the 480 would have been faster than it was, but AMD never lied. The clues to its performance were there in the pre-release presentations. Of course, they showed it in the best light possible against Nvidia's latest and greatest, but anybody with an interest in graphics cards would have been able to deduce what I've written here from that first presentation. Performing similarly to the Geforce 970 and 980 was a bit disappointing since those cards were out a year earlier, but not anywhere close to $200. We've covered price and performance, 2 factors that Polaris is competitive in, but I think Polaris' main goal was to improve the efficiency of AMD's graphics cards. Let's see how it performs. The first battle, the Radeon 480 versus AMD's older cards. The 480 is as fast, while being much smaller and consuming a lot less power. Well done Polaris, you win this battle hands down. The second battle, Radeon 480 versus the Geforce 980. The 480 is almost as fast, while being much smaller, but consuming the same amount of power. This seems more like a draw. And in the grand scale of things, to only draw despite being much smaller is disappointing. The Geforce 980 is based on the older, inferior 28nm node. That's why it's larger. Polaris, on the other hand, uses a newer, smaller 14nm node process. It could be this that is why Polaris is so small and efficient, but it does mean that if Nvidia switches to something smaller, they'd improve as well. Which happens to be the case with the third battle, the Radeon 480 versus the new Geforce 1070, which is on a smaller, newer 16nm node. This results in a loss for AMD. Nvidia's 1070 is considerably faster and consumes roughly the same amount of power, making it more efficient. Although this is bad news for AMD, at least Polaris will never be compared to the Geforce 1070, which is more expensive. It will be bad if Nvidia makes a cheaper card based on this new tech, something like a Geforce 1060 perhaps. The next month, Nvidia released the Geforce 1060, which was as powerful as the 980 before it, but now on a smaller node. Its size was now tiny. At 200mm squared, it was even smaller than Polaris. I think the Geforce 1060 was better than the Radeon 480. It was faster and more efficient. Polaris was still good. As long as it was priced a bit lower, which it was, then it was an equally attractive product. I don't know if that's what AMD wanted from Polaris, mind. I think they'd have been happier if it could compete at the same price point. But hey, here is how the two cards compared in benchmarks. While a lot of hype was made for the Radeon 480, I was more impressed with the slightly slower, slightly cheaper 470 that came out soon after. It was the same card with the same efficient architecture, and although not VR ready, it was still almost fast enough. You could probably wing it. And it cost just $179. Nvidia soon launched the 1060 3GB to compete. It had less RAM, but performed better than the Radeon 470 in most games, and cost a bit more as well. The 470 and 80 were both based on the same Polaris design, but there was an even smaller one created that became the even cheaper $119 Radeon 460. This was a lot slower than the 470. I don't think that any of us could have predicted how low AMD was going to go with this card, but it was still able to game at 1080p and was good enough for key esports titles. Sadly, it's as though Nvidia knew exactly what AMD was doing, and they even had a Geforce 1050 lineup that was, once again, a bit faster and a bit more power efficient than the Radeon 460. How convenient for Nvidia, having cards that seemed almost perfectly designed to compete with AMD's Polaris. Let's show all of these cards and order them from slowest to fastest. The Geforce 1050 matches the Radeon 460. The 1050 Ti is better, but the Radeon 470 is better again, by a long way, and costs only slightly more. What a bargain. In these games it nicely matches the older Geforce 970. The 1060 3GB is better still, the Radeon 480 above that, then the 1060 6GB, then the 980, and finally the Geforce 1080, miles above everything else. So all in all, you'd expect the Radeon 400 and Geforce 1000 series to be relatively tied in popularity. All cards serve a purpose, if priced accordingly to performance. Let's take a look at how many were bought. There's no easy, reliable way of doing this, so I'll just have to go off the latest Steam hardware survey. And these were my findings. This blows my mind. It's depressing, it really is. For Polaris, which was released first and at an aggressive price, to have such a small market share compared with the Geforce 1050 and 1060 series, there really are no words for it. You can argue whatever you like, but the evidence is undeniable. The Geforce 1000 series won the mid-range battle, by a landslide. I can only assume a lot of it is brand loyalty. Although I see the products to be relatively balanced, it appears that most people, or at least companies, go with Nvidia regardless. They're good products, they really are, but it's just sad to see AMD's Polaris struggling to get anywhere in the market. If anything, we have AMD to thank for Nvidia's huge success. Had it not been for Polaris, we most likely would not have seen the Geforce 1050 or 1060 series out so soon and at such low prices. It's perhaps because of AMD that so many buyers have obtained such good cards at such low prices. It's just that most of them weren't bought from AMD. But let's try and find some other reasons for this, because there are a few things that I can think of. For starters, and this could be the big reason, depending on where you lived, AMD's Polaris cards might have been more expensive than the competing Geforce cards. I'm afraid I don't have much information on this. Being in England, at the time I didn't think about what it cost in America or India or Malaysia. If Polaris was priced more expensively, then I agree, people should have bought the Nvidia cards instead. It's a very price sensitive product. But then in other places it could have been that the Nvidia cards were more expensive. So yeah, price variations could have been a factor. Let's move on to the second reason. Polaris had the potential to be remarkably efficient, if set to the correct voltage and frequencies, and I think that somewhere along the way, this was lost. I partly blame AMD, who generously overvolt their cards to ensure they're stable. This also makes them run hotter, and in some instances, slower. Adored TV did a video where he undervolted his Radeon 480, keeping it just as fast while saving 15 watts. Not a bad saving. I also partly blame third-party sellers. The faster the card, the more they can sell it for. So what do? They overclock Polaris, add extra power connections to fuel it, and a large fan to keep it all cool. This makes the card big, hot, and power hungry, all for a slither more of performance. This was particularly bad with the Radeon 460. This card was perfect as a low power gaming solution that didn't require extra cables. So why add extra cables to it? And why would it need crossfire? I wonder if all this overclocking was done to close the gap in performance between Polaris and the rival Geforce cards. But I just think it makes Polaris look even worse when it consumes so much more heat and power in an effort to match Nvidia cards for performance. I really do wish that they had just gone with Polaris' sweet spot of price, performance and efficiency. even if it had been a bit slower and cheaper than Nvidia's products. Oh, and a third possible reason would be the drivers and software. I don't think AMD's were particularly bad, but since the initial launch of Polaris, they have rolled out several large improvements to the bundled software. These have added features and have generally made it a lot better than it was previously. As a YouTuber, I couldn't even use AMD for a while because they didn't have an answer to Shadowplay. That all changed with Relive, launched at the tail end of 2016. And I don't know what happened with laptops. The Radeon 460 had a low enough power consumption to be perfectly suited for cheaper portable gaming systems. And yet I never saw them. There were plenty of laptops with the Geforce 1050s and 60s in them. Also, after the initial hype, VR didn't take off. Had it become the next big thing, I'm sure that many people would have bought the cheapest VR-ready card that they could have, which most likely would have been Polaris. But as it was, those who did upgrade likely weren't doing so for VR, and so maybe getting a card with the Geforce brand was more important than obtaining the lowest priced VR-ready system. AMD later launched the Radeon 500 lineup, which were just rebranded and revised Polarises with $10 knocked off the asking price. The 570 and 80 were a bit faster than the 470 and 80, but consumed more power, which I personally saw as a step in the wrong direction, but it closed the gap in performance between them and the Geforce 1060 series. And some games started coming out that were optimised for technology that AMD was particularly good at, and in those games, Polaris finally pulled ahead of competing Nvidia cards. And then the mining craze started. Using graphics cards to mine Bitcoin suddenly became very profitable, and AMD's cards turned out to be better suited to the task than Nvidia's. Suddenly, those $200 graphics cards were being sold for 2 or even 3 times higher than that. Not for gaming, but for mining. Now, I've heard people twist this into a bad thing for AMD, claiming that they didn't receive the extra profit from these sales, or how it would reduce the number of AMD cards being used for gaming, so developers would focus less on making their games work well for them. But I disagree. I think mining was great for AMD. As far as I'm concerned, AMD could sell every last Polaris card that they made. If they're not doing well from that, then they're doing something very wrong. Since then, the mining craze has died down a bit and prices have returned more or less to normal. No doubt lots of old, worn-out mining cards are now flooding the market, and when they eventually fail, AMD will get the blame and get the reputation for selling dodgy cards, even though it was the mining that was to blame. I'll accept that as a downside to the whole mining thing. So, Polaris. Affordable, powerful, and hardly anybody is using them for gaming anymore. What's next for AMD's mid-range graphics card range? There are lots of rumours going around at the moment. There may be yet another rebrand of Polaris coming out, so there's a chance there's another important chapter left in Polaris' story. But I'm happy to move on to my conclusion about it for now. Polaris has been a valuable asset in AMD's graphics card lineup, and I think it's been a success. In part thanks to the mining boom, AMD made money from Polaris. A lot of money. And I hope they've been putting it to good use. It takes years to develop and to release a new graphics card, so it could be a while before we get the cards made with all that extra money. For now, the next new design to be released will be Na'vi, which rumour has it will replace Polaris, giving us faster cards for less money than ever before. At which point everybody will rush out and get a Geforce 2060 instead. Here's a short video I made before Polaris came out, where I speculated about it, Vega, and Ryzen. It's interesting to look back at it with hindsight.